All right, so I'm going to go over the best game I have played to date, which was about, I don't know, 2 or so months ago. So playing English with a white. So we'll turn on the engine within Chess and see what happens. So begins with c4 and black responds e5. And I've been doing the fianchetto setup, so I go with g3. Knight to f6 is played. And then we do bishop to g2. So I'm not worrying about the knight development yet in the center, although knight to c3 could have been played as well. And then we get knight to c6. And then I want to emphasize the control over the white squares. So we have the bishop on this diagonal coming through the center, but we get in knight to c3. And black goes with bishop to b4. Now, there's a choice that white has to make here because you could continue development, and usually you should emphasize the continued development of the pieces. So you could look to potentially knight to f3, d3 is an option, but I think these moves in the center are a little slow. Because there is no pin and we still have our pawn on d2, then knight to d5 makes a lot of sense and is standard theory. So instead what happens is, and let's just get some more lines here. What I wanted to do was show a couple options, multiple lines, yes. So we would like to see 5 lines. Okay. Now for some reason it's not displaying, just 1 second. Line notation. Anyway, 5 lines, so that's fine. Okay, so then n2 d5 is played. So in this case, what black could do is go back to c5, but bishop to c5, but they don't for some reason, so they decide to castle. And this gives us an opportunity to take this bishop. So therefore, removing the... So the problem, of course, is that we've gone to d5, and now we're going to capture. So the knight's moved 3 times. And meanwhile, black's played a good developing move with his castle. So what we want to do here is, and you can see the engine's pointing out that a3 is of course a good possibility as well. Just threatening the bishop again, it would have to go to c5 and we could get b4 in for free, where it would have to come into d4 and then we would have to move our rook to b1 because the bishop would be sitting here, but we'd have some nice expansion on the queen side. So I didn't do a3 and instead decided to capture, right? So in this case, he decides to capture with a knight. And now we should not worry about that knight on b4 at all. It's much more powerful on c6 because it controls the dark squares in the center. If it's off to the side, we just leave it and we should focus on development. And that's why I go knight to f3. And now he plays I think a decent... He could have played e4 actually, and because this knight becomes a target, and then it would just push. And instead he goes... One sec. Instead he goes with d5, which seems like it should be a good expansionary move in the center. But what it allows is this pawn is unprotected on e5, and so we could have captured. And so instead, and the computer certainly likes to capture on e5, and I didn't exactly see that. The other thing that does is it opens up this diagonal for the bishop. And so if he decides to capture on c4, then this bishop will have this long target into the rook here, and it's going to be very difficult for black to develop this bishop without b7 becoming a target. And so he may have to place a very weak move such as c6, which is very slow. So I should have captured on e5, but I didn't, and instead decided to take into the center, because usually a wing pawn capturing into the center is a good idea. So in this case, he does play e4. and that's not a good move. He should have kept developing. He should he should take the opportunity to get this bishop out while he still can, and then deal with this weak pawn on b7 eventually. But this allows me to play knight to e5, and I did that to, again, ignoring this pawn in the center and centralizing the knight. So he has a bit of an advantage at this point because he can take the opportunity and should have played queen captures, bringing another piece into the game. It looks a little dangerous because of the bishop pointing into the queen, but he has good protection of this pawn with both the queen and this knight that's on f6 that I can't really challenge at the moment, right? So then you've got, so his bishop, his knight on the b file comes back into the center, which is a decent move against centralizing. So I'm behind in development, so now I have to really push. So I decided to go with safety and castle, and the evaluation is showing a little bit of an edge for black at this point. So in this case, he should certainly develop, and he should probably develop the bishop, but rook to e8 is absolutely fine. That gets a rook onto a central file. And this is where I decided to really be aggressive in the center. And so what I wanted was to really I had to come up with a way to develop the dark squared bishop. And so I do that with d4. And this is where he starts to go slightly wrong. So this pawn is quite strong in the center, and I'm gonna have to like really ruin my position to get rid of it, like either with f3 blocking the bishop. It's going to be a problem. So he starts to kind of lose the plot here. So he captures en passant, and now what I do is, because this knight is going to this bishop is going to control e4 really well, what I decided to do was capture with the knight. So it looks a little strange in that I'm going backwards, but the knight was under pressure from the rook, so we just want to stabilize our position, and we're back to almost even. And his next move, bishop to f5, certainly makes sense. So that's covering the white squares in the center. So black is doing fine here, and the evaluation's about even. And now I want to develop my bishop, and so my last minor piece, so I get that out, taking advantage of the fact that this knight, which is controlling the white squares in the center, is now pinned to the queen. And this is where he starts to, well, not so much on this move, but I think there could have been better moves here. He should look to get this rook developed, right? So queen could go to c8, developing this. He could maybe start to push these pawns a little bit. The queen on c8 would support a push of c5. So instead what happens is he plays c6, which I thought was a little slow, but it does reinforce the knight in the center. If I capture, of course, he could recapture with the queen. And so that's an option. That's an option there. So in this case, after c6, I want to increase my control in the center. We know that this is pinned because of the queen. So if I can get e4 in safely, but there's still three pieces attacking it with the rook and these two. Well, the bishop anyway. So I played rook to e1, trying to increase my control in the center. And now he plays knight to g6. And there wasn't a lot of purpose to this move. Bishop to g6. The bishop on f5 is already in a very good spot. And so he should continue his development, in the computer suggesting things like queen to b6, get the queen out, get the rooks connected. This rook on a8 would be able to come into d8. So queen to b6 certainly looks logical, controlling all the dark squares in the center. But instead, bishop to g6. And this is where he starts to kind of go wrong. So I take advantage of the fact that I have my bishop, which has now become very powerful, controlling the white squares, and the fact that this knight is pinned, so it can't capture on e4 safely, and I aggressively push with e4. So we've been under a little bit of pressure throughout the game so far, and now we start to really push into the center. So we're taking advantage of the fact that this bishop move was inaccurate. I didn't see the point of it at all. And so this is where he starts to, on move 15, where I think the opponent started to go really wrong. So he plays knight e7, and better choices would have been b6, of course, like maintaining some control over the center on d5, and instead goes all the way back. And this is a terrible move because he's blocked his rook's influence. So the rook was well placed on e8, but now he's just blocked it. He's taken all this control that the knight had over squares like f4, e3 in the center, and moved it all the way back, also impeding his rook's control. And now I want to continue development, so the queen should come out and we should get the rooks connected. Obviously, with the queen exposed here, it would make a lot of sense, and not just that, but the fact that the d file is semi-open now, there are no pawns on it. These knights are going to have a very difficult time. They cannot get to d8 because of this pawn here. So what we should do is develop the queen and then bring the rook on the a file into the center, right? So the computer suggesting queen to c2 certainly makes sense. I liked b3 more. It gives the same evaluation, and white is up about 2.1 pawns. Queen to b3. Now he should certainly develop his queen, and he does so, and it's not a bad move. And he gets off the central file, which I do agree with. And now, of course, what I could do is, if I take, that will not only open this file for the rook, potentially creating a weakness, but also his pawn on a7 will come into the center. And this could potentially be a problem. So what I do here is I get out of that capture. I'm not interested in the capture. And I play queen to c3. And his move, queen to b6, was good because he does have control over the dark squares, but he's still in a little bit of a problem. I'm now threatening to capture on f6, right? Because if I do that, if I take with the bishop and its pawn takes, then queen takes, and his whole, although he does have good pieces protecting his king at the moment, that's going to disrupt his pawn structure, and should mean that I can eventually storm my pawns down the h file, carry the h pawn, and come down the h file and really challenge him. So what he does is, on the next move, he should absolutely centralize this rook. It should be rook on a to d8, like not even a question. Get to that open file, develop your last piece, but for some reason he plays knight to d7. And what he's desperate to do is, he was concerned about f6, understandably. It's not ridiculous what he's doing here. But again, he's going backwards. And so this does allow this knight to come to here, but I have good control over e5, right? I have the knight attacking it. I have the queen challenging e5. The queen is now safe. It can't really be attacked very easily by the queen. And so machine's looking at things like a4, but what I really wanted to do here is centralize the last rook, right? So it's like, in the same way that I was saying his rook should go to d8, I'm going to do the same and play r8 to d1. Now he should, again, same problem, he should develop that last rook, and he's falling further behind because he decides to move the queen to b5, and his piece development isn't finished yet. So I think he should have taken the opportunity to again move that rook. So he's had now 3 chances to develop that last rook, and I think he really should have. Okay, so now my bishop is not so effective here. And so the idea I had was, let's get control over the center again, and let's do bishop to e3, right? It's not really doing anything there. We definitely don't want to capture on e7, so let's get it back into the center where it's controlling the dark squares and take it from there. Now he plays r8 to d8, and finally does centralize his rook. But that came with a big weakness, right? And in this case, what it allows is knight to c5. And so certainly, and I did see this move event. I played it 2 moves out, but what I could have done is play um, bishop to f1 here, because this pawn is no longer under pressure. We don't need to worry about it anymore. We also could play f4, again adding more control over e5. So you want to control the center. So I played bishop to d4. It's not a horrible move, but I think with this bishop guarding the dark squares into the king, f4 is more safe, and I probably should have pushed it. So anyway, I didn't do that, and instead played bishop to d4, going after, of course, the g7 pawn. Next is he plays f6, and that's a very weakening move, right? So now I notice that with the bishop on this diagonal, the queen is potentially trapped because c6 is a problem. It's blocking as a queen. So I play bishop to f1. And now he realizes the problem and could have gone to g5, but instead goes to h5. And so what I did here was continue to chase the queen, and I want to maintain my dominance in the center. So he's gone backwards, even though his rooks are in good spots. They're blocked by the knight. And the key problem is this knight cannot develop. So c6 is covered. This pawn covers these 2 squares. This knight, he should be desperate to get it forward, but I have control over it with my knight here, the bishop on d4, and the queen. So his knights, he's going to have real trouble unblocking these. So this knight move continues to control the center, also threatens to come into e6, but more importantly gets another tempo on the queen. And the computer at this point, so now I'm up by 6.7 pawns, and Stockfish is suggesting that he's in such trouble that he actually take the rook on d1 and just which brings a point, because I would recapture with the rook, leaving e4 open, and then he would capture on e4, of course. So he's just like desperate to break open the center, but he doesn't do that and decides to go back to h6. So now the queen is really in trouble. So at this point, I'm looking at this and I'm like, the knight should come into e6. It's got a safe square. We can still go after the queen with the bishops on e3 and d2, threatening the white squares and the dark squares around the queen. But I get into e6. And now he plays bishop to h5, just challenging the rook. But in this case, so he leaves open the possibility that I could just capture. And of course, I probably should have calculated this correctly to take. And then if he takes, then I take, and he takes. And the rooks are, again, opposed on the d file. And the computer actually preferred that. But instead what happened was that we had, and then he's noticing the pin as well. So the bishop going to c4 would make a lot of sense as well. But we go to e3, just challenging the queen again, and he goes to g6. Now I come back. Now I should take on d8. This is where I made some inaccuracies. This knight is in an excellent position. There's no way it should be retreating. It's threatening that rook on d8. We should keep it in place. So this was a mistake, not a blunder, but it lost a couple of evaluation points. And now the queen, of course, can take on e4, but decides not to. So he goes back to e6. I come back into e6, where really I should never have left. And in this case, he starts to get desperate and really loses the plot. So with g5, that's incredibly weakening around the king. And what I do here is I simply decide, so he's shielding this, but of course I have things like h4. But what I first want to do is just prevent the losing the exchange. So I just simply go rook to d2, right? Now he goes rook to c8, again going backwards, but he's sort of desperate and he has to open this file, and it does make a lot of sense. And here I decide to capture on d8, it's not a terrible move. It may even be close to the best. We're up about 9 pawns at this point, so we just have to finish the game off. But what happened was I decided to capture, and instead I could have just simply um, done the bishop to c4, protecting the knight on e6 and also threatening, of course, the discover check against the king. So I decided to take with the idea that the rook now again is blocked, right? So he's blocked by his own knight on d7. So here I do find bishop to c4, which was nice. The king's quite exposed, right? So we got to take advantage of this. This pawn potentially is quite weak too. So we have this, and then we have bishop to f7, and I do decide to take it, bringing the king into the picture. So we're up in exchange, so we might as well take material. We have an exposed king. We're up in exchange. His rook is not on an open file yet, so it's good. And now we want to continue the attack. So the computer suggesting queen to b3, which would, of course, put the king in check and threaten b7 as well. I chose c4 instead. It's not quite as good. Wanted it to be reinforcing e4, so I thought it would be better, but the computer preferred queen to b3. King comes forward, which is very dangerous given the exposed nature of it. So I come in with queen to e6, and now he plays queen to g7, and this allows the queen check on f5, and he comes forward still. Now this is losing, right? So it's now up to 16 pawns. We're getting very close to where we should be able to completely destroy the king. So the tactic that I missed here was that bishop should take on g5. And if that happens, f takes g5, then we have simply g4 with check. That has to go back to h6. And then, of course, we have e3. The rook would lift to e3, which would allow this to come over a threatening mate. So even if he does something like this, well, of course, now can take on d7 as well. But the other issue is, because when the rook lifts off the back row, it can be queen to f8 with check. But the obvious move is bringing the rook over to h3, forcing the queen there. Then we have the rook taking on d7. If rook takes on d7, then we take this with check, right? He comes forward. We have things like this. Now it's made in 12 moves. So we have e5, and the king is in huge trouble. So let's go back to the game. So here, I did play g4 right away. It went there. And now I played h4, right? So the pawn storms around the king are good. We're starting to really threaten the... Now he's trying to bring the knight into e7 to save it, but that misses the point, because now I can just capture on g5. So now it's mate in 10. I don't play this fully accurately, but I play it well enough to keep myself in the game. So h takes, opening this file, right? Queen should take, but he doesn't. He takes with a pawn. And now the idea is opening this, the sixth rank. It should have been knight to d6. Now that this knight is moved from c8, d6 is no longer protected. I didn't see that. I should have thought about how to bring the rook into the game. But queen goes there, queen comes here. And now I decided to exchange here, and then, which leaves his rook exposed, so just take on d8. So we get material off the board and end the game. I didn't see the checkmate possibilities, but it's knight takes g4, and the rook comes back in. This comes forward, and at this point I realized that if I can get to d4, this could be quite dangerous. So the king again coming forward, big mistake. And now I realize that if I can get my rook to h1, we're going to be in business. So I play well, I certainly should have played king to g2, which I do eventually, but f3 is okay for now. Just kind of forcing the knight to move. It moves over there. I take on e5, he takes on e5, and now I go to g2, and he misses the idea that he traps his king with h6, and then I can bring the pawn over with checkmate. So that's the best game I played to date. I really enjoyed this one, and I thought my control in the center was pretty good. I didn't have perfect tactics at the end, but in general, I was with pretty happy with the way it worked.